In today's video I'll be painting two Stormcast Eternals in the Hallowed Knight color scheme in some easy to follow steps. One of them to a reasonably good battle ready standard and the other to a parade ready one with some cool extra effects thrown in. But before we start, I wanted to thank you all for helping me reach 10,000 subscribers. It's a huge milestone for the channel and I'm super proud of getting there, but I couldn't have done it without you guys. Thank you so much. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURE. So if you want to see how I chose and painted all the base coats, did all the shading with contrast paints instead of traditional washes, then went in with some simple highlights on the battle ready model and some extra steps on the parade ready one, finally adding some cool but easy to do effects like glowing eyes and the green swampy base reflected on the armor, then let's get painting. And let's start with the base coating phase on the Black Prime model first. Before anything else, I wanted to get all the normal acrylics on the model before I started with the metallics. Those are better done at the end in one batch so you don't contaminate the other paints with metallic pigments. The first color I started with was the blue for the shields and the shoulder pads. And technically I could start with any color, but if you want to be strategic about it, it's better to do the colors that cover bigger surfaces, especially if they have other elements inside or behind them. For example, the shield has a lot of decorative elements that will be different colors. If I paint those first and do the blue around them later, it's likely that I would mess them up quite a bit, or I would have to be super careful, which takes time. Instead, I will paint the blue and then paint the little details later, and if I get a little bit on the blue, it will be easier to clean up. Once I got full coverage on the blue, after 2 or 3 coats, I switched to burnt red and covered the plume fully. The golden halo is once again inside the plume, so it's better to paint the red first and then the gold element inside it. Next I switched to the leather bits with whole red, which despite the name is more of a reddish brown color. These small bits are quite deep in the nooks and crannies of the model, so it's better to take care of them early. If you hit stuff around them, it's fine, since those things you will have to paint later anyway, covering the mistakes organically. On the simple model I also painted the shafts of the weapons with this color, but on the parade ready one I switched to purple for some extra detail. Then I used buff on both models to paint the streamer on the spear, covering it fully with multiple layers, but on the parade ready model I also painted the scroll work on the shield, once again for some added detail at the expense of some effort and time. Finally, I also painted some parts of the Sigmar symbol on the shield and the shoulder pad with deck tan on the fancier model. On the battle ready version I left all these elements unpainted for now because the plan was to simply paint them gold later for a quicker and simpler color scheme. With that I was done with all the normal acrylics and it was time to switch to some metallics. I started with bronze for the scale skirt, making sure to paint everything, even the bits peeking out from under some of the other elements. Then it was time for the biggest surface and defining feature of the Hallowed Knights, the steel armor. And for this I used 2 layers of gunmetal. Arguably this is the most important color on the mini, so it's worth paying extra attention to make sure you covered everything. Since we are painting this over black, it's easy to leave some black peeking through the steel, so if in doubt, add more layers. Finally, I finished the base coating by covering all the decorations with gold. And to be honest, the gold from AK Interactive is not my favorite, and I only chose it for consistency since I used AK paints for everything else. All the other colors are excellent, but maybe go for something with better coverage for the gold if you can. The end result on the gold looks quite light for now and similar to the bronze, but we will take care of that in a second. One final step before that though, I didn't add the ground texture before the priming phase because I wanted to use its natural color, so now I covered the base with some muddy ground texture paste. The idea here is that these guys are trudging through some swampy orc-infested area, or maybe even the Plague Gardens of Nurgle, you know, one of those lovely places Stormcast usually spend their time. And with that, the base coating phase is done and all the colors are on the models, but they look quite flat and unfinished, so it's time to do some shading to add some contrast. And most painting guides at this point would tell you to use some Known Oil and Agrax Earthshade and be done with it, but I will show you a method that is slightly slower but produces better results. We will simply replace the shades with some contrast paints. The idea is simple. Contrast paints do the same thing as shades, they flow into the crevices and create contrast, but they also do some other things better. For example, while shades tone down the colors while darkening the model, contrast paints are super pigmented and preserve the colors much better, plus you can also add some extra tones onto the model with them. As you can see, I started out with Black Lotus Express color from Vallejo on the steel armor, and this color will be the only non-citadel contrast on the list, but I love it too much to leave it out, because it's not simply black, it also has some blue and green tones in it. Instead of just simply adding black onto the armor, this will introduce a bit of color while also creating contrast. If you want to do this with purely Citadel contrast, then I suppose you can mix up a little bit of Black Legion with some blue and green contrast paints and use that instead. I know this sounds like heresy, but I actually add water to it on the wet palette and apply it like that quite liberally. But I will wipe it away from the big flat surfaces whenever I can and guide it towards the recesses. Depending on how dark you want the armor to be, you can apply 1 or 2 layers, but make sure the first layer dries fully before you add the next one, or it will create a mess on the surface. The next contrast shade will be done with Fire Slayer Flesh. This is the perfect color to make the gold more colorful and interesting. It has quite a bit of red in it, so the end result will look quite different from the pale gold that we originally had. For the red plume on the helmet, I use one of my favorite contrast paints, Blood Angels Red. Then the leather bits got a wash of Gore Grunta fur, but the purple weapon shafts on the fancier model got some Sigvold Burgundy instead. For all the blues, I used Thalassar Blue. And you got to love these fantasy names in the Citadel contrast line. Normally I don't mind them too much, but saying them so many times in videos can be interesting to say the least. But we are not finished yet. For the streamers on the spears and the scroll work on the parade ready model, I went with Skeleton Horde. The white bits on the fancier model also needed some shading, so I applied some Briar Queen Chill. Finally, on the base, I used a combo of Plaguebearer's Flesh and Agara's Dunes. I simply covered the base in one first and applied the other in some big patches while it was still wet. All the shading was done at this point, and now I waited a couple of hours for them to dry, and then it was time to do some highlights. Once again, I started with the normal acrylic colors and left the metallics for the last to avoid contaminating everything with metallic pigments. The idea is pretty simple. Since the contrast paints darken the original colors down, the same base colors can now be used as highlight colors, at least for the battle ready model. For the parade ready figure, I added a couple more highlights to make it stand out more. Starting with the blue, just like in the beginning, I used the deep blue to bring back the original color on the raised surfaces, but left the darker shaded color in the shadows and in the recesses. I made sure to paint all the blue edges with this as well. For the parade ready model, I did the same, but I went one step further and used Ducat blue to edge highlight everything as well. For the red plume on the helmet, I did a bit more. For both models, I first used Carmine to paint the volumes. Instead of individual hairs, I highlighted the raised part of the plume with this fully. Then I switched to deep red and highlighted individual hairs within those highlights by running the side of the brush over them as if I was edge highlighting. For the fancier model, I even applied a little bit of red ink on the most raised strands of hair to make it even more colorful and create more contrast. For the leathers, I simply went with the original whole red for the highlights on the simpler one and added some extra edge highlights and scratches with British khaki on the fancier one. On the streamer, I used the original buff to bring back the highlights, and on the parade ready model, I added some edge highlights with ice yellow as well. With that, the battle ready model was essentially done except the metallics, but I continued on some of the extra elements I painted on the fancier one. I used the original purple to highlight the spear shaft and the sword hilt. And finally I brightened up the white decorations with Dectan and then with some ivory. Now I only needed to do the metal highlights on both models. I started with the bigger surface and used the original gunmetal to highlight both. I used it to highlight the raised elements and the flat surfaces, plus added edge highlights everywhere, but I left the stained darker metal in the shadows and the recesses. The trick is to water down the paint a little bit on the wet palette and use it to build up the highlights to avoid very obvious marks between the shaded and the highlighted surfaces. For the edge highlights, you can use full opacity undiluted paint. For the battle ready model this was enough, but for the parade ready one I went further again. I didn't have a brighter steel color in my AK range, so I used steel from Vallejo to go up in brightness in the highlights. I used this to paint some of the more prominent edges and to add even more volumetric highlights. This is a pretty strong color with good coverage, so whenever I left a strong separation line, I used a little bit of watered down gunmetal to smooth it out. For the bronze skirt, I used a little bit of the original bronze to bring back the color. I painted all the edges, overbrushed the raised elements on the shoulder pads, and in some places where the light would hit the most, for example on the raised edges of the shield, I painted in almost the whole surface, except the deepest shadows. With that, the highlighting was done, and the only thing left to do was to make the parade ready model even cooler with some effects. First, we will integrate the model better into its environment with a pretty simple method. Remember that Plaguebearer flesh that we used on the base? Now we will paint it on the inside of the legs, under the chest and a little bit under the arms. The logic here is simple. The light from the green swamp is reflecting on the metallic armor. So to achieve this, we need to stain the surfaces that are facing the ground with this color, and the closer to the ground they are, the more green they should be, so we should add more layers on the legs. Once I was done with painting the reflections, it was time to make the corresponding lights on the base. I took some olive green and overbrushed it a bit in the middle part of the base. Then I went up in brightness and used some interior yellow in the middle of the olive green. Finally, I took a product from AK simply called Puddle and added a nice amount over my highlights. So much in fact that half of it ended up leaking onto my hand later because I was too impatient to wait for it to dry, so be smarter than me. If you don't have this product, some gloss varnish can also sell the effect of some liquid on the base. Once I was done with the base, I added a couple of dots of red on the little gems the model has on the forehead and the spear. You can put a small dot of white under the red to make it more vibrant. Then I took some pure white and dropped it into the eye socket, fully covering the inside of it. This time I was patient enough to wait until it dried, and I painted the whole thing with some fluorescent blue paint. To make the glow effect even more believable, I made an edge highlight on the edge of the eye socket with pure white and brushed some diluted blue fluorescent paint over the line. The only thing left to do was to add some tufts to the base while making sure that they don't obscure the nice puddle I created. I painted the rims of the bases black as is proper, and the end result looks like this. As you can see, both models look quite similar at first glance, so is it worth the extra effort you have to put in to achieve the parade ready standard? You guys can let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to smash those buttons and let's go for 20k subs next. See you guys in the next one.